Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us for this presentation made by Bjarne Bare. A few words in the beginning about this project, which is related to our work and multi-layered investigation of a photo archive from Romania, the Mihai Oroveanu image collection. There is a website which details all of our activities so far. We did a number of exhibitions, three, and right now at our space there is an exhibition organized with materials from this archive around the very complex and elastic topic of the vernacular. An exhibition which will run until end of November. And within these exhibitions, we also invite artists to organize, to prepare artistic interventions starting from materials existing in the archive. And we don't impose constraints. We want this to be as fluid as possible and as thought-provoking as possible. And in such a context, we also had the pleasure to invite and to know Bjarne Bare. His name came to our attention after we had a discussion with our institutional partners, partner from Norway, from Oslo, Photographic. We thought that Bjarne might respond in a let's say perceptive manner to the topic of the vernacular, so he is the author of the first artistic intervention taking place in this exhibition, which runs throughout this whole month. So you are welcome to our space to see it. It is now, it has been installed. And now a few words about Bjarne Bare. He is based in Oslo and Los Angeles, and is the co-founder of Melk, an artist-run space in Oslo focused on new Scandinavian photography and which activates since 2009. His work is complex. He is both artist, gallery director, and publisher. You can check his website, bjarnebare.com, where, for example, you could see a list of his publications. Very interesting. We look forward to seeing and knowing in depth some of them. As an artist, his work has been presented in institutions like Fondazione Bevilacqua alla Massa, and from Palazzetto Tito in Venezia, the UCLA Broad Art Center, Los Angeles, the Xiamen Photography Art Center in Xiamen, Kunstsnærhus Oslo, and many other places. Bjarne, we look forward to hearing your talk focused on your recent practice, and at the end we also invite the public to know more about your work at Salonul de Proiecte, which is now installed into our space, and we are very excited to be able to show it and to know you. So you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Magda. I appreciate it. And yeah, thank you, everyone. It was really nice to get this invitation from Salonul de Proiecte, and it's been a really nice process so far, working together on this. I've always been interested in archives, so you know, your invitation kind of intrigued something in me right away, even before looking at the work at hand, because I'm just interested in photography as an expanded potential, and I think archives often show a broader body than just a selection, which is usually what we see through books or through curated exhibitions. Like when you have the luxury of diving into an archive, you can actually see all the in-between works that are not necessarily the ones chosen out or the ones that make a life. And I like to see my work kind of living in there, in the in-between spaces. And I thought I would take you through some of my exhibitions since 2014. So it's going to be a kind of a 7-year journey. I'm going to focus on a few exhibitions, not on my publishing or my curatorial work, but I'll show briefly like some links in the end if people are really interested. I just I want to keep it semi-short. I just want to see if I can share my little slide there. Let's see. There. So let me just see if I can. So I just want to talk a little bit about, I'm choosing this specific project also because it was a point of departure for me that I've kind of, I had an epiphany and I kind of stuck through since 2014, mainly about an understanding of what a photograph can and cannot do, and a potential of kind of something that I like to call pensive images. I'll talk a little bit about that later. But actually behind me here, I have my body of work that I made as my thesis in Oslo at the Academy of Fine Art in 2013. So it was right before I went to Venice. And prior to that, I was working with quote unquote street photography, because I thought I wanted to work in a documentary tradition, and I traveled extensively focusing on that. But I found a lacking in that. I kind of lost interest in telling stories. I was more interested in the image per se and what the image had as an extended potential, as a medium. And I think this comes from a deep love for painting that I had when I was growing up. And not being a painter myself, I think I felt a longing for this understanding of how you build up an image and how you can make like one image that you can live with for a while, that can ask questions instead of giving you answers. And for this, I came to the understanding that photographs live under this big pressure of being a didactic medium, where you always expect to learn something when you look at one. And this is in stark contrast to other media. At least that is my experience. So that kind of started informing my understanding of photographs. And I mean, I was very fortunate because I didn't have much of a career back in 2014. And I was invited to this pretty prestigious art residency in Venice in Italy, through Office for Contemporary Art in Norway, which had a collaboration with Bevilacqua La Masa, which is a 200-year-old institution in Venice. So they usually work with young Italian artists, and they have been doing this for 200 years. And for that year, they wanted to try to expand internationally. I mean, at least with European young artists. So I was one of the I was the one non-Italian invited there. So I got to live in Venice for 3 months in this beautiful old palazzo. And I lived there with 8 other Italian artists my age, which was also an incredible experience. And then kind of unplanned, they just offered me a very big solo show. And, I was pretty young at that time, and trying to do a task like this with a very short amount of time was very stressful. And I think the most stressful part was that I was in Venice, which is the most photographed city in the world. There's 12 million tourists circulating there with cameras. every year. So I had to find an angle that was somehow original or somehow could tell something about the city, being photographic, but also telling something maybe more interesting about it. And I started photographing these boat engines because I grew up in Norway, and I found this really peculiar tradition that the Venetians do, where that they simply, when they don't use their boats, they cover up their engines in cloth, and no one does it the same. Everyone has a different signature on their cloth, and to me it didn't make any sense because I learned from Norway that humidity and cold temperatures and everything, you want to keep the engine and the metal circulating, and it just didn't make any sense to me, and I couldn't really get a clear response. And in my mind, they kind of look mummified in a way, and it seemed to me that people visit this city to kind of escape. It's literally the only place left where you don't have any cars and you feel like you're so removed from modernity. Yet the city has an incredible infrastructure hosting 12 million tourists a year. So there is this massive maze of boats and canals. And when they don't use these boats, they cover them up and kind of try and hide the modern impact on the cityscape. And I found that really interesting. And I started photographing these over and over for a while. And at the same time, I was reading a lot about painting and, modern contemporary painting as well. And I came across this article written about this war between Frank Stella and this painter called Martin Barre, which is lesser known American painting, but he made a big impact on me. So basically Barre painted really like formal, simple canvases that were untreated, and he just added lines. And him and Stella had like a back and forth. And basically this quote from the review said, what Stella seems to be telling young painters is that the future of painting can only lie in three-dimensional space or in some kind of interaction with it, by way of acknowledging and accentuating its status as an object. As you all know, Stella was using, shaped canvas to try and reinvent some kind of new way for painting, how painting could break free from the standard rectangular or square shape. And then further on, what Barre tells them instead is that the future of painting should be excavated from painting's own categories, primarily from its surface rather than from its support. That there is certainly enough complexity to be found there to sustain another round of generational investigation. And it was specifically that last part that I found interesting. I mean, this is back in the 60s, but the fact that there were, the painting has been declared dead so many times, but there's always enough complexity within the medium for another generation to explore. And it really resonated for me. And I started photographing these over and over, and I was going pretty close, pretty abstract, but you can still tell what it is. And I mean, my photos are, quote unquote, pretty straight photographs. They're snapshots basically, but I think there is so much to understand, which I will get into further as I talk more about my other exhibitions, but how you can understand the limitations and the possibilities of what a painting can offer, or a photograph with just flatness, surface, and what is missing in a photograph, basically. So I installed these. This was also my first solo exhibition, and I was offered this beautiful palazzo in Venice and installed these prints, and got a pretty good response, which also I was nervous for because I was showing these mainly to a local audience, and I'm photographing their city and I'm an outsider, and I got a really good response, and I thought that maybe I'm onto something. At least this body of work has also been very dear to me personally, because it felt like a simple approach to a complex problem, and I thought this is something that I can continue venturing into. I was really interested in surfaces, and it felt a little banal at the time, and in some ways it still does, but I think that banality really opens up a broader perspective into what the surface of a photograph really is, and what it carries, without saying anything, or without necessarily insisting on telling anything. But when you see them together, they start to activate each other, and they give you hints of what lies beneath there. So then further on, I was asked to exhibit this at this gallery called OSL Contemporary in Oslo. And this is the gallery I now work with mainly. And I invited a young Norwegian artist called Tiril Hasselknippe, who has these sculptures you see on the floor. As I thought it would be nice to kind of activate the space. I felt, I had already shown this body of work. She had this body of work because I knew this, which was also maritime in a way. They're like anchors made out of brass. And we made this installation together. And it was really interesting to see how this work translated really well to a Norwegian audience outside of the Venetian, local audience. And I realized that you don't really need to have a very specific, local angle. You can create pretty universal works like this, and that opened up the mind for me a little bit. Here are a few more other photos with Tiril's sculptures.
Bjarne, one small question, if I can.
Please.
You're having in mind this kind of analogy between photography and painting. You are saying earlier that you took snapshots of the engines that you found. But what kind of camera were you using? I mean, was it a long process of taking the photos? Was it a large format camera, or they were actually snapshots, as you said?
Yeah. I mean, they were shot on a SLR, single lens reflex. So it wasn't long. I never use a tripod, and I still work in a similar way. I work in medium format now, but large format has always been too slow for me. I need to move, and what I usually do is I move around, and then sometimes if I'm not happy, I go back to the same subject. But yeah, so they literally treat it as snapshots. But I make sure I'm there at the right time of the day. Sometimes if I decide to go back, I make sure I check the light conditions before, so I get the angle right and stuff like that, and obviously a good exposure. But no, I don't set up beforehand. Unless I shoot something in the studio, which you will see. On some occasions, I shoot people. I'll also talk a little bit about that, about my problem with portraiture. But yeah, usually they are, I carry a camera and a strap on my shoulder, and I walk the streets. So that's my process. This body of work later became part of this exhibition called Sakte Bilder, which means slow pictures, at Lillehammer Kunstmuseum in Norway. And that was also interesting for me because I was really happy to see that there was an understanding of that photographs can be slow, and can be, especially the word I'm interested in is pensive, which is a Roland Barthes term when he talks about the studium and the punctum. But pensiveness is something he comes back to over and over as a quality a photograph can hold. And I decided to include this photograph because this is around the same time after I finished the other project. I showed this body of work in China, and I started to get really interested in repetition. I think you can see a link between this and the work behind me on the wall that I showed you earlier. But I was interested in repetition and time, and again pointing back to what is lost in a photograph, in a single capture, and what we see and don't see outside of the frame. But I was also really interested in insisting on the flatness of the medium, and how the actual surface of the photograph is what carries the meaning, more so than anything else, if you think of it in abstract terms. And I started being really interested in, I mean, through this, you know, an obvious link is to look at modernist painting, where there was both repetition, you know, I focus on flatness, but also I focus on the grid, and the grid is what anchored the movement of modernist painting. And the most important thing was that it moved it away from, let's see, I just have to move you guys over here. It moved perspective away. And there's an amazing text by Rosalind Krauss, just simply called Grids from 1979, where she really points to this, and it was really helpful for me to read this essay. But she basically says, unlike perspective, the grid does not map the space of a room or a landscape or a group of figures onto the surface of a painting. Indeed, if it maps anything, it maps the surface of the painting itself. And the understanding of the grid became really important for me because it does something to perspective. And I realized that by removing perspective, you can enter another dialogue with what is in a photograph and what is outside of it. Another issue I've realized is that photography is a very Judeo-Christian medium because it stems from a central perspective, just like iconography does in both Jewish and Christian, iconography. And it's a very Western way of seeing things, and it's a very Western way of building up. If you compare it to ancient Asian art or paintings, there's usually a vast landscape without a single focus. And you can't really escape this with a camera. The camera is built in a way to feature our idea as we are raised in a Western way of thinking. And this is one of the reasons I struggle with portraiture in my own work, but also, it has informed my seeing. And I, for instance, I included this photograph of a window. This is from an exhibition in 2017 called If Then Because Since and So. What I was interested in this window piece, it's a very simple picture, but the idea is that you cannot see through the window. Everything is a flat surface, it's covered, and then you have this shadow coming in, informing you of something you are missing in the outside world. In like Hollywood cinema, this effect is called a MacGuffin effect. It's when they include, like, you watch a Hitchcock movie and there's like a phone ringing in the background or something, and you have this idea of something else going on outside the frame. And I'm really interested in including that in my photographs from time to time to introduce a different layer, and to also insist on the abstraction of the medium, that you simply cannot include everything in the image, although you look at it and you accept that it's there. So there's the whole dialogue with representation as well that I will talk about. So this body of work also became a book published by Hasla Books in 2017 in New York. And the title for it, If Then Because Since and So, is actually a string of words I found in a textbook for elementary school children, where they teach young children to look for these words in the English language. When you want to teach a child how to understand how to build up a sentence, classical syntax, you look for these connecting words. And that's how you kind of understand logic on how things are interconnected. So I thought that was like a nice way to build on these. I was also really interested in the Lacanian gaze at the time, and how he has this, he's famous for his allegory about the tin can of floating in the ocean, that, he sees the reflection when he's out fishing, and he's reminded of his own existence, and he has this meltdown, intellectual meltdown, while trying to relax being on a fishing trip. But an easier allegory for how the gaze functions, in his view, is by entering a bar, and you are looking for someone, and you are like scanning the room. That's how the gaze functions. And then as soon as you meet someone's eyes, the gaze is completely broken, and your brain shifts into a different way of thinking, a different modus, and that also really introduced me to a way of understanding like how an image is built up. Most photographs have this singular point of view that is supposed to attract you instantly, while in my opinion, you can try and create an ideal image where your eye can wander around and where the gaze lingers longer along the picture plane. So I made these pegboard installations actually in my studio, which are classical, garage or shop pegboards where you can hang your tools for your products. And I put these rubber bands on, and I made all these different types of variations, also to play with composition, but also to suggest the way where the eye, the way an eye can move around a surface. And here, back to Rosalind Krauss, the same essay where she says, this is like the nice part of that essay, I think. She says, the grid declares the space of art to be at once autonomous and autolectic. In the temporal dimension, the grid is an emblem of modernity by being just that, the form that is ubiquitous in the art of our century, while appearing nowhere at all in the art of the last one. In that great chain of reactions by which modernism was born out of the efforts of the 19th century, one final shift resulted in breaking the chain. By discovering the grid, Cubism, De Stijl, Mondrian, Malevich landed in a place that was out of reach of everything that went before, which is to say, they landed in the present and everything else was declared to be the past. This really simple understanding of how you can introduce grid and flatness, they left no room for perspective and depth. And just by that simple move, they managed to make a pretty radical shift in our understanding of how you build up something like a painting, or just removing perspective, which I also think connects directly to photography today, at least from my understanding. So I pair these works 2 and 2. Here, is one of my pegboards with rubber bands, and then I have a garage that someone has been trying to remove some graffiti, and you have these gestures that are both, they're painting gestures, but they're also they create an abstract form, and they become very picturesque, and the way these work together became really interesting to me, and I had a really good process working with this work. And here is a bigger installation that I made at a museum called Sørlandets Kunstmuseum in Kristiansand in Norway in 2018. So you see some of how these operate a little more together, and how I was hoping that the pegboards kind of reactivate your understanding of the flat surface of the, formal pictures that depict normal scenes, but how they can play with abstraction and depth and flatness. So back to Lacan, I assure myself that I know quite a lot about it. I assure myself as a consciousness that knows that it's only representation, and that there is beyond the thing itself. And this is how, I tie it up to my understanding of archives as well, that we have to remember that we are looking at representations of things, and we often, with photography, will often circumvent the medium, and we forget that we're looking at a medium, but we think that we are looking at the object or at the people, but we forget that there is this representation in between that we are actually looking at, and this is quite important for me. So I moved on to creating more, I would say, formal images where some were staged. This was a project I did about the international rubber industry, which was exhibited a couple places. And this is from Preuss Museum, also in Norway, in Horten, in 2017. My interest here was finding a story, which, for me is a political and documentary story, which is something that is close to my heart, but how I can tell this story without necessarily going there and necessarily photographing, the people and making a classic documentary approach, but how I can tell a similar story by creating images. And I started for instance, this, which was shown at an artist-run space called Louise Danny in Oslo, which was in an artist couple living room, technically. It was a really nice place to have a show. But the thing here is that I went to Ohio in the US to a little town called Akron, which used to be the rubber capital of the world. So it was a city with a big economy, lots of industry and lots of prosperity. And the whole economy there collapsed. And, you know, the city has kind of been falling apart since. And I was really interested in this town for the rubber industry because a lot of that money was built on slavery, basically, of the rubber trade around the world. And I wanted to go there and I want to kind of show how this city had changed. And I went to the owner of one of the big tire companies of Firestone, and I found their mansion. And back in the 30s, during the Depression, that was the biggest mansion built in the US. It's a pretty impressive estate. And I went to the rose garden and I just photographed the roses there, and I titled it Frank Augustus Desires, because Frank Augustus was the owner at the time of the company. And I realized that by creating this kind of symbol, I can have the whole story of this town conjured and talked about, instead of trying and documenting the whole city in itself. And I think the images you create by seeing this and maybe by hearing about the story of the city are enough. Your mental images might be enough just by looking at something, even something pretty, you know, in a dark story. You know, to visualize rubber, I did this tire that for me, you know, kind of looked like an infinity sign. I've done this again later. I photographed a woman from Liberia that fled from Liberia during the conflict there in the 90s, putting on a Firestone pin from 1991. It says 91 on the pin. 1991 was the year Charles Taylor worked with child soldiers in Liberia, and Firestone actually let him put the child soldiers on their plantation land, and they let him use their gasoline and their hospitals so that they could continue their operations uninterrupted during the ravages of the war there. And so, you know, I was attempting these approaches and how you can create images that go louder or speak more than necessarily what they depict alone. And this really changed the way I'm thinking about photographs today, and the way I think about setting together images into a space, and the way images activate each other. You know, in a room, you enter a room and photographs can activate a space as an installation, and they can awake memories in you. So you don't need to have 5 to 10 images creating a narrative. You can kind of awake that memory. And that also goes back to the title that I have shown, that I've decided for the project in Salonil de Proyecte now, you know, with you, Anamnesis, which I'll mention a little bit later. Sorry for this really long quote. I'm going to go through it really fast, but this is a really important quote from Peter Osborne. And for me, it was interesting because there has been very little contemporary theory on photography, really, and especially, you know, in the 90s and the early 2000s. And I just want to jump quickly into his idea of, he calls photography a post medium or a trans medium. He says we can't claim that photography is a medium, and I'm going to just jump right in. I'm going to say the whole question of where the photograph is problematized, which turns out to be as difficult to answer under conditions of chemical-based analog images as it is as a result of digitalization. Is it, for example, as ordinary language suggests, to be identified within the photographic print? Hardly, for this is, at least potentially, a multiple. Although a print is one place it might be found, is it a negative? But this is a negative or tonally inverted image. And anyway, a film might remain undeveloped. Is it then the image captured on the photographic plate or film? After all, photographs are what one takes, one each instance, however many prints. Yet this is perversely unviewable until developed. It soon becomes clear that to ask where is the photograph is the wrong question. Put simply, there is no single side of the photograph. The photograph is not the kind of thing ontologically that can be strictly identified in spatial terms. There is a disruptive unity to the photograph itself, as well as to the broader field of the photographic. Insofar as the question can be meaningfully addressed, the photograph is distributed across the sides of its process, which it permeates as an image, derealized, albeit in a peculiar ontological state of dependency upon a process that it transcends in each of the different technological forms. Hence its peculiar combination of generality and specificity. There's a direct ontological affinity here between photography and the conceptual aspect of art, which is rendered explicit in post-conceptual art. For there is no fixed place of either the photograph or the work of art. And he connects this directly to, for instance, the land art movement, which was using landscape and nature, which he also claims you can't really claim that it is a medium. And he puts photography in the same place. And I think this understanding of the photograph being everywhere at the same time, not in a single space, is really interesting also for my understanding of how abstract this is, because we really take the images for being direct representations of reality, which I think is a big problem also, especially now in contemporary politics and how images are misused for propaganda. So this is an exhibition I did in 2020. I was really fortunate because this exhibition opened in February 2020 before anyone knew about COVID or anything. And it was also pretty funny because it was called Breathing Together. So that kind of became ironic in a way. But this was in Oslo, and I hope it kind of makes sense through what I've been saying so far. But to me, at least, in my mind, there's been a lot of culmination of the last 6-7 years of thinking into how I structure this exhibition, and also how I have been working with my own archive, because I used to work in a way where I was very like a classical photographer. I was getting an idea for a series, for a body of work, and then I was just photographing one thing over and over and building this like logical body of work. And I found that I wasn't really happy in that process, because I had like good days and bad days, and then maybe someday I didn't feel like doing that, and then kind of ruined my process. And then I started photographing more loosely and just building an archive for myself instead, informed by different things I read or things I see on the news. It can be really anything. And then I end up with this vast archive, so that when I have an exhibition, I can actually build something for the space based on the time I'm showing it. And I can create something really much more interesting as a total installation. And creating a non-linear kind of logic in photography, thinking of it more as a sculptural installation in a space rather than trying to build a narrative like from left to right or A to B. So this exhibition came together based on works I had made from 2018 to 2020. So it's like 2 years of work. And there were 3 themes in this show. I'll just go through them really quick. The main theme, which is something I still work on, and it's also, I think, a strong part of what I sent you. It's this theme called nostalgia for the present, which is this idea, this psychological idea that you are living a good time right now, so you're already nostalgic before it's gone. You're like feeling nostalgic for losing the good times you are in. That's very simplified, but it struck me that it's something that has been used very cleverly by right-wing politicians the last 5 to 10 years. They play on nostalgia, especially in terms of immigration, in terms of the economy. You're going to lose what you have, this and that. And I found that this is also a very strong theme in European, not just politics, but just everyday, thinking. Somehow it feels like a lot of Europe's future lies in its past. There's a lot of nostalgic ideas. So these two were kind of paired like that. I had this photo of this like sad couple kind of disintegrating. It's a little sculpture that's falling apart. And then I have this photo of this Romanesque building in the back, which you can't see that well here, but it's under renovation. And I built this structure in the middle of the space to play on the idea of the like kind of museum archive. But also I use materials that are used for greenhouses. So there's a way in UV rays and, heat, just a lot of these elements. And I have this photo of the tire to the left again, this time an inverted one, like a Mobius strip, but I titled it tribology. And that is a term that comes from friction and wear. And it was coined in the 60s in Great Britain, where they were trying to find out how much society loses in industry, how much money they lose by friction, by materials disintegrating in the industrial space. And I figured this term tribology can also be applied to politics, to religion, and to climate, basically today, where a lot of these frictions that appear are man-made, human-made. Nature kind of resolves its own frictions in a way. And yeah, so as you see, I'm not going to walk you through all of the works, but I wanted to see how I thought about resolving the space and how, as you walk through, the different photographs kind of activate each other and kind of activate your mind and let you resolve them, almost like a riddle. But I was really surprised how well the audience responded to this, because it was a very well received exhibition. And it seemed like it didn't go too cryptic. I was also really interested in the digital infosphere, and one of the issues and one of the themes, the third theme for the show, I got from this amazing Italian philosopher called Franco Bifo Berardi, who has been very important for me. But he talks about how we have lost the idea of communicating through conjunctions, but now we are communicating through connections. So basically by conjunctions, he means we used to communicate by meeting people randomly in intersections or in person. Now we are communicating through connections which are chosen for us by algorithms. And this is why we have a lot of friction in society these days, because you end up mainly meeting people that are like pre-chosen for you. And we are going backwards to a tribalistic society. And so I was interested in the digital, and I tried to find a way to show that somehow. And I came across this billboard that I was able to access, right up front. So this is detail of a massive advertising billboard. You can kind of see the Facebook logo to the right if you squint. But anyway, instantly I thought back to my idea of the grid and what Rosalind Krauss has been saying about the removal of perspective, the speed of the digital, and also how this is a mirror of the digital surface, or the surface of the digital camera. The sensor records in red, white, and blue as well. So all these made real sense to me, and I installed them. I could talk about the people as well, but I installed them face to face in this space. And one of the key images for me was this one, which I called The Shape of Time, after the book by George Kubler, who I'll talk about soon, but has also been central for me while I was looking at the images from your archive. This is simply a sculpture from the Museum of Anthropology in Mexico City, which is an incredible museum. You can be lost there for days. It's so vast. But this sculpture is 5,000 years old. And when I came upon it in the museum, I just felt it was so kind of lost in time, and it felt a little paranoid. And it really, I stood there forever, and I kind of, as you do in an anthropological museum, but something like really resonated with me, also not really knowing where it came from. And I was reading the book by George Kubler at the same time, and he became important to painters such as Ad Reinhardt in the 60s, because he wrote this book questioning the way we know history through readings from archaeology and historians, but he didn't necessarily trust their conclusions on how history is, mainly because human time and biological time is so different. And through history, we set human time first. So we set history by all these events, while biological time is fluid. And to him, that was a big problem because technically time is fluid as well, and everything is informing each other back and forth. I'm just going to read one quote from his book, but it's kind of one of the conclusions he has. But he says, when we scan things for traces of a shape of the past, everything about them deserves our attention. Yet this conclusion, which is self-evident once we recognize that things alone allow us to know the past, is generally ignored under the demands of specialized study. Archaeological studies and the history of science are concerned with things only as technical products, while art history has been reduced to a discussion of the meanings of things without much attention to their technical and formal organization. The task of the present generation is to construct history of things that will do justice both to meaning and being, both to the plan and to the fullness of existence, both to the scheme and to the thing. This purpose raises the familiar existential dilemma between meaning and being. We are discovering little by little, all over again, that what a thing means is not more important than what it is, that expression and form are equivalent challenges to the historian, and that neglect either meaning or being, either essence or existence, deforms our comprehension of both. So, this is pretty complex, but I hope it makes sense how I relate this to photography. If you look at photographs as singular entities, and how you look at photographs as the real potential of what a photograph is, if you look at their surfaces, this is like at the core of my understanding of the increased potential of the image. And then just quickly, I want to mention Tristan Garcia, because this is a short essay everyone should read. So everyone can find it by Googling it. There's a PDF. But he says the representational object is not a copy. It does not imitate another present object, but rather it presents an absent object. And Tristan Garcia puts a dash in representation. So he says representation, and it's really important for him. And that's just something I want to touch upon a little bit. I'm coming to the conclusion now. I just wanted to mention this exhibition I had this summer, actually, of 2021 in Los Angeles at a new space called No Moon, which I called The Itch. But I was asked to do an exhibition there in a rather small space. So I just included 4 images. And, I was really wary about creating a post-COVID exhibition, or what do you talk about after this? So I put together these 4 images in the show that somehow could tingle, or I titled it The Itch, because I really felt like what we are all feeling now together is this some kind of unresolved itch. There's an itch you can't scratch. There's a tingle, you want to get out, you don't know what to do, you feel a little trapped. And like the other exhibition, which was more, obviously bigger in scope and more theoretical, I went back to my archive and I looked at what I had and how I could talk about some universal feeling. And I really enjoyed working with this show because it's a really amazing space in East LA, and the people are amazing. And also my hats off to Peter Tomka, who runs it. But I wanted to create a space where you entered and you were faced somehow, but I didn't want to create a portrait or anything because it would take too much attention. So I put this image of the cat that I found sitting on the roof of a utility truck with all these ladders, and I found this composition to be pretty modernist in its flatness and in its grid like the halls and everything. And I paired it with this close-up of 2 cars that have crashed, that have come to a complete stop, and on the final wall, I included a photograph of a bank to the right, and that bank has this very fortified entrance that you can't enter, and it's showing this again this LED screen circulating of this ideal tropical home with palm trees and everything. And then to the left is a growth structure from a greenhouse, which is again this like inside and outside, and the growth is like coming out. So yeah, I had fun. So again, to kind of show my way of thinking in like in editing a show, in how it can be abstract, but at the same time, I think awake emotions and feelings with people. And just briefly about archives and about Foucault's diagram, Gilles Deleuze mentions this as the diagram is no longer an auditory or visual archive, but a map, a cartography that is coextensive with the whole social field. It is an abstract machine. It is defined by its informal functions and matter, and in terms of form makes no distinction between content and expression, a discursive formation and non-discursive formation. And then finally, it's a machine that is almost blind and mute, even though it makes others see and speak. And this is how you can really understand an archive at its fullest potential, I think. It makes others see and speak, and it activates memories in you. And the works in there are informed mainly by your current state and your current place in life when you look at them. So finally, to the works I included for Salon del Proyecto and the little project I called Anamnesis, I chose 2 works made this summer. So that they're extremely recent. Usually I let works sit a little longer, but I had your archive in mind and the idea of the vernacular. And I was thinking about the vernacular as, a very personal way of remembering history. And to me, the vernacular is a way we all, kind of remember history in a communal sense. And then I was thinking about the other aspect of history, which is monuments, and how monuments and buildings are so extremely different in terms of time. And then I came across this column of a building being restored, and I saw this other column of the scaffolding because they're repairing the old column. And you have this, temporal space between the temporal column and the old column, and this idea of like repairing the old monument to remember a time that is past. And to me, that really related with the images I saw in the archive, also trying to imagine Romania from a very different way I've always been told how Romania is or looks. I looked at the archive and I found all these images of joy, of optimism and leisure, and it felt like a really true representation of a time past, and a more fluid biological representation than a representation like a monument does. And then back to George Kubler from The Shape of Time, he says, biological time contains the unbroken events called lives. It also contains social organizations by species and groups of species. But in biology, the intervals of time between events are disregarded. While in historical time, the web of happening that laces throughout the intervals between existence attracts our interest. And then finally, he says, purpose has no place in biology, but history has no meaning without it, which is, to me, that's a brilliant quote that really makes me understand the passing of time in a better way, also through images. And this is finally the other image, also from a monument, that it has this like very classical, heavy marble weight and feeling of us. And it's just a way we communally choose to represent time in a society, rather than looking at actual, histories from real people. And this contrast I found stark, and that's why I wanted to tie all this together by selecting 80 images from your archive and putting them on this slide projector, and just simply creating this contrast between the lived lives and the symbols that a monument creates, and how these exist together in our society. And you can make your own decision on which one is more important, but for me, the lived lives are the more important histories. And I really enjoyed going through the images and just seeing all the optimism. I'm sorry I can't show them all in this talk, but I hope people can actually like spend a little time and look at the images and get a sense of a past time that is not necessarily in the history books, which was like a beautiful thought I found. I hope that makes sense. And then again, just to end with Lacanian quotes, which might be a little over the top, but he says, in our relation to things, insofar as this relation is constituted by the way of vision and ordered in the figures of representation, something slips, passes, is transmitted from stage to stage, and is always to some degree eluded in it. That is what we call the gaze. And I love that with the idea of a slide projection, because these images, they keep going in between my works and they slip, and you can keep your gaze going and just keeping reinformed over and over. And as a whole, you kind of get an understanding of this body of work in an archive. So that's it. I hope that makes sense. I know it's, my mind is a rabbit hole, but I hope it makes sense what I try to convey.
Maybe it's good now for me to try to show a little bit the installation, but probably
it's possible.
Bjarne, I'll try.
Well,
yeah.
just to show the idea of the machine, changing through, it doesn't have to be perfect. But...
The thing is that probably I'll have to keep on talking or something.
No, this is okay.
Or maybe pin the image. Yeah. So the slides are here. I'm not sure about the light. If
no, it's
you
okay.
Can see some, yeah.
It just, this is more something you actually come and see in person because of the nature of the slides, but just the idea of the images shifting in between. It's hard to see the subject matter over Zoom like this, but yeah. Thank you for showing that.
I wanted to ask you about the way you make these connections between your images. Is it always for an exhibition, or sometimes you connect them without any very clear purpose?
Thank you. I live with them, so usually the connections come before the exhibition, because I live in the studio, so I live with them, and I print them full size always, and I install them, and then as they come, they get grouped together, and usually from those connections, I start to venture into an idea of a project or a theme. But I print one image, then maybe 2 months pass, and suddenly I have another from a different site, and then I put them together, and the way they inform each other starts to create the path for me of a logical reading. And I just found that to be a very interesting process, working process.
But this is interesting because you print the selection, not all the images, no? So you reduce the amount.
Yeah.
And do you ever revisit the ones that were not printed?
I do, and it's funny. I was actually just looking at some works from the Middle East that I took in 2007, and I didn't really use those images for anything. And now I suddenly have, a decade in between, and just a completely different understanding. And there's so many works in there that are certainly interesting to me, but that I didn't feel were that interesting back then because I was too close to the material and to the memories of the place.
Mm-hmm. And also I wanted to ask something about the size, because it seems that all of the exhibitions have these big images. How come?
Yeah, I work in one size and one format, and I found this to be helpful for me already back in Venice when I did that project, which was kind of by chance. It was like the biggest size that printer could make, so I was like, I want that size. And then I realized when I was installing that show, and I realized every photographer has a specific distance to their subject matter. you can always recognize a photographer by, we usually stop at, it's strange, but when you look at different photographers' work, there is a connection to where you stop in front of your subject. And I realized with the relation I have to what is photographed, when I print at this scale, gets pretty close to 1 by 1, and you get this extra level of dialogue with abstraction or reality. And I felt that was really interesting. And then I realized if I just stick to one size and one format, I have one less thing to think about when I build an exhibition. I have eliminated a question. It's just going to be that size, and my camera is always vertical, and I have less things to think about. It's very pragmatic, and it's just become something that I'm really comfortable with now, and I enjoy working with.
But it seems that the dimensions are connected to the idea of contemplation as well. I mean, can we contemplate an ideal image, but small, that
absolutely
can be small?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, I love that when I do books. I also been doing a lot of books, and I love how you can create an intimate space. Another thing with books is that not only are they small and intimate, you contemplate differently, but you can, it's like, you can, there's solutions, but usually you're limited to 2. So you're limited to pairs. And I like how that dialogue changes when you move from a room to a book, and how you edit, and how fluid photography can be in that sense.
I wanted to ask you, thank you for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
I wanted to ask you about your relationship with portraiture, because you wanted at some point to address that, but now I'm really curious to know more.
Thank you for asking that. I wanted to talk more about it earlier, but I felt I was spending so much time. The main reason for me with portraiture there are 2 elements. Basically, I briefly mentioned my idea of photography struggling with having this Judeo-Christian perspective, where it's very closely tied for me with classic iconography, where you have this one thing you look at, and that is the ideal form of an image, and it's really hard to escape that with photography. And when you do a portrait, you have that in a really higher state, and it's very hard to circumvent that. Another thing, I've been talking a lot about the gaze and how your eyes move around a space. It's kind of impossible with a photograph. You can do it if you have the sitter kind of looking down instead of directly in the camera, but it's really hard to create an ideal image for me where you are actually still operating your eyes around the space without focusing on a single theme. And then lastly, when I install portraits in a room, we as humans are so, we're so obsessed with other humans that when you install a portrait in a room, and especially the scale I work in, everyone just goes straight to the portrait, and the portrait kind of punctures the space. That's also why I installed the cat in my last exhibition, because I wanted something there that was confrontational when you enter that little space. And I tried with a portrait, and the portrait just took all the attention. I put a cat in there, and the cat kind of did the same. It activated the space. It was confronting the audience, but no one was like obsessed with it. Like, who is this, or who is this person? So there's so many levels of complexities with portraiture that I'm working on, but I still haven't quite resolved. And so it's it's on my plate to figure it out, definitely.
Yeah, it also sets a complicated relationship with the contemporaneity and how images circulate nowadays on all these networks, where the face, the personality is
absolutely. And there's a hierarchy of images, and images of people always are on the top of that hierarchy of the pyramid. So that's also, it's not necessarily problematic, but if you want to think about the potential of a photograph, it's a problem that we create these hierarchies.
Yeah, I think it is hugely problematic, and it's something worth fighting to dethrone somehow.
Thank you. Yeah, I try.
And about your connection to this particular archive, it was an important point, the fact that you had this memory of living or growing up or spending maybe a little time in Poland. I don't
Absolutely.
know exactly.
Well, not only living there, but I was born there, and I came to Norway as a 4-year-old in '89. You know, as many others who left the region back then, but we kept going back every year. And I have these memories of, you know, being on holidays in Poland and being at the discotheque with my mom, you know, and a lot of the images I saw, you know, it really stirred a lot of memories and emotions with me, and good memories. And that's what I was struck with, you know, especially since I haven't been, you know, no one has showed this side of Romania to me. And it's part of the history of the country that you know hasn't been discussed. And I think the same goes for Poland. You know, no one really talks about, you know, the 80s were really hard and tough in Poland, but no one really talks about what happened at the nightclubs or what happened at the vacation spaces. And it is also an important part of the history. I'm not trying to like romanticize because those years were pretty complex, but it is a part of the history that, you know, that kind of sparked memories with me, and I think is equally important to remember. And that's back to the title Anamnesis, which is this mix between knowledge and memory, which I love about that word, because knowledge and memory are actually two different things. And it's important to also make space for our memories and not just of a historical knowledge, you know, of a time. So that's that.
I think it's interesting that in this selection that you made from the collection, there are a lot of staged images. So in a way, our memory is already staged.
It's true. It's true. I found those images to be kind of extra special because they also create something, a way you want to be presented, you know, and it's something we do all the time in our daily lives, and it's kind of we're trying to glorify our memories, kind of like the monuments I chose. So there was a link there as well, and I just found them to be extra interesting. I mean, there was also a majority of in the archive, but I think that staging is also interesting because it's something we all do, you know. Not just with selfies, but just like when traveling, you know, we stand in front of a monument or something, and we try to like make this memory last somehow through a photograph, which actually, you know, it lasts longer in our memory, but we have this obsession with the photograph, which I find interesting, kind of like monuments are as well. So thank you. And I also, yeah, thanks again. It's been really fun to work with this over the summer. So I appreciate the invitation. And I'm sorry I couldn't come and visit in person. I would love to see Bucharest, but hopefully the invitation stands and we can hang out some other time.
Thank you very much, Bjarne, for the wonderful presentation. And
thank you, Bjarne.
Thank you so much.
Pretty sure the public will come to enjoy,
I hope so,
lively the installation. And I don't know, good luck with everything. Take care.
Thank you, you too.
Of yourself. And maybe, I don't know, maybe you'll make it here till the end of the year.
You have to.
I know. It will be great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.